The gavel had not even fallen yet when Sallie Wallace stepped through the wide-open doors of the Millhaven Livestock auction barn, and every head in the place turned as though pulled by a single invisible thread. It was the autumn of 1879, deep in the Texas Panhandle, where the sky ran wide and flat, and the wind had opinions about everything. The town of Millhaven was not large enough to be famous for anything besides its twice-yearly livestock auction, which drew ranchers and cattlemen from as far north as the Canadian River breaks and as far south as the Caprock edge. The barn smelled of hay and cattle and the sharp bite of pipe tobacco, and the wooden bleachers that lined the interior walls were packed with men in dusty hats and worn leather boots. A few wives sat in the upper rows with folded hands and careful expressions, watching the proceedings the way women watched things they had no official part in, quietly, sharply, missing nothing. Sallie Wallace was 31 years old, and she had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas Wallace, had died of a fever in July of 1878, leaving her with 400 acres of decent grazing land, a modest herd of mixed cattle, a 10-year-old daughter named Clara, and a mortgage payment that arrived on the first of every month without sympathy or delay. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned beneath a practical felt hat, and brown eyes that had learned over the past 14 months to look at the world with considerably more calculation than they once had. She was not a woman who invited pity, and she had made sure of that early on, when the pity had come calling with casseroles and sympathetic tilts of the head. She had thanked each visitor, eaten what needed eating, and then gone out the next morning before sunrise to manage her cattle the way Thomas had taught her when they were still young and still foolish enough to think the land owed them something. She wore a dark blue riding skirt that day, practical and slightly dusty from the road, and a cream-colored blouse beneath a fitted jacket that had seen better days but still held its shape with dignity. She carried her leather bidding ledger tucked under her arm, and she walked to the lower bleachers with the kind of quiet deliberateness that people notice when they are not quite sure why they are noticing it. The murmur that moved through the crowd was not unkind, exactly. It was simply the particular sound that a crowd of men in 1879 Texas made when a woman came alone to bid on livestock. It was surprise and curiosity and something just beneath that, something a little less generous, the collective assumption that she was confused about where she was, or that she was there on behalf of some man who was too ill or too busy to come himself, or that whatever she bid would be emotional and therefore amusing. Sallie took her seat and opened her ledger without looking at anyone. She had done her arithmetic 3 times the previous evening by lamplight, with Clara already asleep in the back room and the autumn wind pulling at the roof shingles. She knew exactly what she needed. She needed 2 good breeding bulls, and if the prices ran right, a quality quarter-horse stallion. The cattle she already had were solid enough, but they needed better blood in the herd if she was going to produce calves worth selling at a profit next season. She had spoken to a livestock man over in Tascosa 2 weeks prior, a gruff old fellow named Herschel who had advised her without condescension on what to look for in a bull's conformation, and she had listened to every word and written it down in her careful hand. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Douglas Pete, climbed to his platform at the front of the pen, with the familiarity of a man who had done this thing so many times it had become the central fact of his existence. He called the crowd to order with a tap of his gavel, and a voice like a church organ played too loud, and the auction began. The first several lots were unremarkable, a group of yearling heifers that went to a rancher from up near Amarillo, a pair of mules that caused brief but enthusiastic bidding, a coop of laying hens that nobody seemed to want at any price. Sallie tracked each sale in her ledger with small, neat numbers and waited. It was during the bidding on the 4th lot, a fine-looking Hereford bull with good hindquarters and a thick neck that suggested exactly the kind of hardiness she needed in her herd, that she raised her wooden bidding card for the first time. She raised it cleanly, without hesitation, calling out her bid in a voice that was perfectly audible without being shrill. The barn went briefly quiet. Not silent, Douglas Pete kept his rhythm going with practiced ease, but there was that particular quality of silence that exists inside noise, when the noise around a thing becomes more careful, more attentive. Every man in those bleachers looked at Sallie Wallace, some of them twice because the first look had not quite settled the question of what they were seeing. A woman, bidding, seriously, competing. She did not look back at any of them. She watched the bull in the pen, and she raised her card again when the bidding climbed, and she held her number steady when others dropped away. And when the hammer came down on her bid, Douglas Pete called her name aloud, sold, to Sallie Wallace of the Wallace Ranch, with only the slightest pause before her name, as if he too had needed a moment to recall that her name was on the registered bidder list. There was a scattered sound through the barn. Some men shook their heads with quiet, dismissive amusement. Some leaned to whisper to their neighbors. A few of the women in the upper rows pressed their lips together in expressions that could have been disapproval or something considerably more like admiration. It was difficult to say. And then there was Alfred Conroy. He was sitting in the far left bleacher, 3 rows up from the floor, and he had been sitting there since before the auction started, which was a habit of his, to arrive early and get a good seat near the aisle where the animals were walked out, because he liked to see them move before the bidding started. He was 35 years old, lean and angular in the way that a man gets after years of outdoor work, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the temples where sweat and hat brim had shaped it, and a jaw that held a jaw's worth of quiet expression. He wore a charcoal gray hat, a good hat, the kind a man kept brushed and straight-brimmed, because he had been raised to believe that a man's hat told people something about him before he ever opened his mouth. He ran the Conroy spread, 4 sections northeast of Millhaven, which he had built from a single claim he had filed in 1871 at the age of 27 with borrowed money and a stubborn optimism that the land had rewarded slowly. The way land always rewards effort, partially, grudgingly, and always on its own schedule. He had never married. This was not for lack of opportunity or inclination, but rather because the ranch had consumed his earlier years with the kind of total demand that left little room for courtship. And then because the women he had met afterward had seemed to belong to a different kind of life than the one he was living, and he had never quite found the courage to bridge that distance. When Sallie Wallace had walked into that barn, Alfred had looked up from the program sheet in his hands, and he had looked at her once. That first look was what every man in the barn had given her, a look of recognition and adjustment, the quick visual cataloging of something unexpected. Then he had looked a second time. The second look was more careful, because something about the way she carried herself caught at his attention in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with something he could not immediately name. The way she walked through a room full of men who were watching her and did not change her pace. The way she opened her ledger with the ease of someone who had been doing their accounting and meant to use it. The second look lasted longer than the first, and it told him things. And then he looked a third time. The third look came after she had raised her bidding card for the first time and held it steady through 4 counterbids until the bull was hers. The third look was not curiosity. It was something that had no tidy name, but it sat in his chest with a weight he noticed, and he reached up and lifted the brim of his hat an inch from his head. Not a formal greeting. She wasn't looking at him. She didn't see it, but a gesture that he made anyway because it seemed like the right thing to do, as if his body had made a decision that his mind was still catching up to. The man sitting beside him, a weathered cattleman named Burl Oakes who had known Alfred since the early days, glanced over and raised an eyebrow. "You know that woman?" Alfred settled his hat back down. "Not yet," he said. Burl made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned back to the pen. The auction moved on. 3 more lots came and went, and then a second bull was brought out. A massive dark red shorthorn with the kind of wide chest and solid legs that made experienced cattlemen straighten up in their seats. The bidding started at $40 and climbed quickly, and Sallie Wallace raised her card twice, then 3 times, then held it up at $95 when the crowd had thinned to just 2 other bidders. One of them dropped at $98. The last one, a heavy rancher named Clement Ferris who ran a big operation west of town and who had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anything he could buy, called 105 without looking at her. Sallie wrote something in her ledger. She looked at the bull in the pen. She raised her card. 110, she said. The whole barn heard it, not just her voice but the steadiness in it. There was no tremble in that voice, no apology, no feminine softening of the number. $110, the same as if she had said it 1,000 times before. Every man in the building looked at her. Again. Some of them for the second time, some of them adding to the count they had already started. Clement Ferris turned his thick neck and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts annoyance and assessment. He called 115 without much hesitation, but he was watching her now in a way he had not been watching her before. Sallie wrote in her ledger again. She pressed her lips together, not in doubt but in the way of a person running final calculations, and then she raised her card. 120. Clement Ferris sat back. He folded his hands across his belly and stared at the front of the barn for a moment, and then he shook his head once, a small dismissal that could have been directed at the price or at the woman or at both. "Sold," Douglas Pete announced with his hammer, "to Sallie Wallace of the Wallace Ranch." From the far left bleacher, Alfred Conroy was already on his feet. Not dramatically, not in any way that drew attention. He simply stood, because sitting had stopped being comfortable, and he moved down the bleacher steps and found himself standing at the end of the aisle near the lower gate, close enough now that he could see her more clearly. She was writing in her ledger again, recording the price, and there was something about the set of her shoulders that told him she had just spent more than she had planned, or perhaps exactly what she had planned, and that either way she was satisfied with what she had bought. He almost spoke to her then. He got close enough that he could have, but then a handler moved between them with a lead rope and the moment passed, and he told himself that he was being foolish and went back to watching the next lot come out. The quarter-horse stallion came at the end of the auction's first half, before the short break when men drifted outside to smoke and water their horses, and exchange the kind of talk that men exchange when they have money in their pockets and opinions about livestock. He was a gray roan with a white blaze and the deep chest of a working horse, a horse that had been well handled, and showed it in the way he moved through the pen without showing whites of his eyes or throwing his head. Sallie stood up from the bleacher when he came out. She stood and watched him walk, just watched him with her head slightly tilted and her ledger held flat against her side, and whatever she was seeing in that horse, she liked it. The bidding on the stallion started at $60 and moved faster than the bulls had. There were 5 serious bidders and the number climbed through 80, through 95, through 110. 2 bidders fell away. Then it was Sallie, and a young rancher named Pete Haskell who had probably been there on his father's behalf and was bidding with someone else's money and therefore someone else's courage, and Clement Ferris, who had apparently decided that losing one lot to this woman was sufficient and he was not losing another. At 135, Pete Haskell put his card down and shook his head. At 140, Sallie raised hers. Clement Ferris said 150. He said it with a finality, the voice of a man who was done playing. The barn was very quiet. Sallie looked at her ledger. This was the edge of what she had, the very edge, the number she had reached in her arithmetic the night before when she had pressed the pencil down and written the final sum and known it was the limit. She looked at the stallion in the pen. He stood with his head up and his ears forward, and the afternoon light coming through the high barn windows caught the silver gray of his coat and made him look like something out of a story. She raised her card. 155. The room took a breath. Clement Ferris turned and looked at her with something that was no longer assessment but was something harder, something that wanted to flatten her, and he opened his mouth. 170, said a new voice from the left side of the barn. Every head swung. Alfred Conroy was standing at the end of the lower bleacher with his arm raised, his bidding card held up, his hat brimmed straight. He was not looking at Clement Ferris. He was not looking at the horse. He was looking at Sallie Wallace with an expression that was direct and quiet and said something she could not yet read. Clement Ferris's mouth closed. He looked at Alfred for a long moment, doing some of his own calculation, and then he shook his head once and put his card on his knee. "Sold," Douglas Pete called, "to Alfred Conroy of the Conroy Spread." The break was called 10 minutes later, and the barn began to empty out around the edges, men pulling on hats and moving toward the doors, the low hum of conversation filling the space. Sallie was writing in her ledger, closing the cover, doing the small, organized things of a woman who was about to stand up and face what came next, which was the business of arranging transport for 2 heavy bulls and managing the cost of that on top of everything else. She looked up and found Alfred Conroy standing 4 feet away. He had his hat in his hands, not on his head but in his hands, the brim held between his fingers with the kind of care that meant something. His face up close was weathered in the way of all outdoor men, but it was a good face, an honest face, the kind that held its expressions plainly without performance. "Alfred Conroy," he said. "I've got the Conroy Spread on the northeast side of the county." She held his gaze. "I know who you are," she said. "I've seen your cattle at market. You run the Wallace place." "I do." He nodded once as if this was information he had needed confirmed. "You bought 2 fine bulls today." "I did," she said. "And you bought a horse I was considering." "I know," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that was not an apology exactly, but was also not without awareness of what he had done. He held her gaze steadily. "I'd like to talk to you about that horse, if you have a few minutes after the sale." Sallie looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the purpose of answering a simple question. "I have a few minutes," she said, and went back to her ledger. Outside, in the pale autumn sunlight of the Millhaven stockyards, the 2 of them stood beside the water trough near the holding pens, while the world moved around them with its usual noise and commerce. Alfred leaned against the fence post with his hat back on his head, and Sallie stood straight, watching him with those clear brown eyes that had learned to be careful. "That horse," Alfred said. "He's not what I need if I'm being straight about it. I've got a working string that's complete and I bid on him because I saw how you were watching him." Sallie studied him. "That's an unusual reason to spend $170. "It is," he agreed without embarrassment. "So what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Conroy?" He looked at her for a moment, and the afternoon light was kind to the strong lines of his face. "I'm proposing that you take the horse at the price you last bid," he said. $155. I'll take the $5 loss as the cost of making Clement Ferris back down." Sallie was quiet for a moment. Around them, a group of cowboys moved a handful of steers toward the loading chutes, shouting to each other over the bawling of the cattle. Somewhere behind the barn, a man was telling a long joke to an audience that laughed in the wrong places. "You didn't do that on my account," she said. "You don't know me." "I don't," he said. "But I watched you hold your price against Ferris 3 times today, and I know what that means in terms of the kind of rancher you are. I've been watching Ferris crowd out smaller operations since I came to this county, and I have a particular dislike of it." He paused. "The horse was a fair reason to do what I felt like doing anyway." She considered this and him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll pay you $160. I won't take the loss from you entirely." Alfred looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it had not quite arrived yet. "That's acceptable," he said. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Conroy." "Alfred," he said. She put out her hand and he shook it, and the handshake lasted the right amount of time and no more. "Sallie Wallace," she said, though he already knew. The horse was a fine animal, and she had been right to want him, Alfred thought as he watched the handlers bring the roan out for her inspection. She ran her hands along his neck and down his legs with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was touching, and the horse stood still for her in a way that good horses stand for people they have decided to trust. And something in Alfred Conroy's chest did the same quiet, fundamental shift that it had been doing since she walked into that barn 3 hours ago. and he acknowledged it to himself this time without looking away from it. The arrangement for the bull's transport was made through a freighting man named Amos Cole, who ran a wagon and team out of the stockyard, and Alfred found himself standing beside Sallie as she negotiated the fee for delivery to the Wallace ranch, because he had followed her there without making a decision to do so, and she had not seemed to mind. She got Amos Cole down $50 on the delivery fee by pointing out that the Wallace place was only 3 miles past the Conroy spread, and if Amos was making the run anyway, he might as well take both loads. Amos Cole, who was not a man easily argued out of his rates, seemed genuinely startled to find himself agreeing. "You work fast," Alfred said as they walked back toward the barn for the second half of the auction. "I work careful," she corrected. "There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. She stopped walking and turned to look at him, and something in the directness of her gaze made him feel as though he had been caught being careless with a word. "Why are you still walking with me, Mr. Conroy?" He thought about it. "Alfred," he said again. "And because I don't have anywhere better to be for the next hour, and because I find your company more interesting than Burl Oak's talking about his knee." The smile that crossed Sallie Wallace's face was quick and almost surprised, as if it had escaped before she had given it permission, and it changed her face entirely, softened the careful lines of it, and let something younger and less guarded come through for just a moment. Then it was gone, and the careful expression was back, but Alfred had seen it and filed it away in the same place he was keeping the memory of how she had held that bidding card. "1 hour," she said, and walked back into the barn. He walked beside her. They sat 3 seats apart during the second half of the auction, which was the appropriate distance for 2 people who had just met, and were in a public place in 1879, but close enough that conversation was possible if conducted at a moderate volume. And Alfred found reasons to make conversation, and Sallie found reasons to answer. And by the time the last lot had been gavelled down, and the afternoon had gone gold and long-shadowed outside, they had exchanged enough words that the day had become a different kind of day than either of them had started with. She told him about the Wallace Ranch in the matter-of-fact way of a woman describing the scope of a problem she was committed to solving. The 400 acres, the mixed herd, the need for better breeding stock. She told him about the previous season's calf crop, which had been adequate but not excellent, and about her plans for the coming spring. She did not tell him about the mortgage or about the nights she sat at the kitchen table after Clara was asleep and did her arithmetic by lamplight and felt the particular loneliness of having a problem with no one to think it through alongside. She did not tell him any of that, but he heard it anyway between the facts she gave him, in the deliberateness of her planning and the steadiness with which she spoke. He told her about his own spread, about the years it had taken to build the herd to something respectable, about the winter of 1876 that had taken 40 head and nearly broken him, about the way the land in that part of the Panhandle rewarded patience more than effort, though it required both. He was a man who did not talk easily or at length. She could see that, so what he offered felt considered, felt chosen. When the barn was nearly empty and Amos Cole had confirmed the delivery schedule for the following morning, Sallie gathered her ledger and stood. Alfred was already standing, his hat in his hand again. Outside, the stockyard was winding down with the particular tired energy of a place that had done its purpose for the day, handlers leading animals to their temporary pens, men loading wagons, the auctioneer's platform being swept clean for next time. "My horse is at the rail on the south side," Sallie said, which was her way of saying that she was leaving and he was not invited to walk her there, though the invitation was open if he wanted to take it. He wanted to take it. "I'll walk you," he said. "It's getting dark fast. I've ridden home in the dark before." "I know," he said. "I'm still walking you." Something in the way he said it, not demanding, not swaggering, just quietly committed, made her be quiet for a moment and then start walking toward the south rail, which was his answer. Her horse was a sturdy bay mare that greeted her with an unceremonious bump of the nose against her shoulder, and Sallie untied her and checked the cinch with a practiced hand. Alfred stood at a respectful distance and watched the light fade out of the western sky, which was doing the extravagant things that Panhandle skies did at sunset, going through oranges and pinks, and finally a deep bruised purple that sat over the flat land like a held breath. "Thank you," she said, her back to him as she tightened the cinch. "For the horse, for the fair price." "Thank you for not making it strange," he said. She turned to look at him over her shoulder. "Why would I make it strange? Some people would. A man spending his auction money to stop another man from crowding out a woman they don't know. Some people would make that strange." "You made a sound business decision," she said carefully. "The horse is worth the price, and Clement Ferris is not worth having as a triumphant neighbor. That's all it needs to be." "Is it?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the fading light. The purple sky was behind him, and his hat brim was straight, and his expression was as plain and honest as everything else about him. "I have a 10-year-old daughter," she said, "and a ranch to run and a ledger to balance. That's what my days are made of right now." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not asking for anything that takes away from any of that." "Then what are you asking for?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening flat land to the west. "Permission to ride out to the Wallace place next Sunday if you're willing," he said, "under the pretense of making sure those bulls arrived safely." "That's a thin pretense," she said. "I know," he said. "But I've found that thin pretenses are better than none at all." This time the smile did not escape without permission. This time she let it come just briefly, and she said, "Come on Sunday then. I'll have coffee on." She swung up into the saddle with the ease of long practice and turned the mare toward the road. Alfred watched her go, the sound of hooves on dry ground fading until there was just the vast quiet of the Panhandle evening. And then he put his hat back on and went to get his own horse with the particular lightness of a man who has just been given something worth riding carefully toward. The bulls arrived the next morning as promised, Amos Cole pulling up the Wallace Ranch drive in his big freight wagon with the two Herefords standing solid and indignant in the back. Clara, who was tall for 10 and had her mother's dark eyes and considerably less of her mother's restraint, ran out to meet the wagon before Sallie had finished her breakfast. And by the time Sallie got outside with her coffee, Clara had already climbed partway up the fence to get a better look at the bulls. "They're enormous," Clara announced with great satisfaction. "Are they mean?" "They're bulls," Sallie said, "so be respectful and keep the fence between you. Mr. Cole says a man named Conroy outbid someone unpleasant to get the horse back for you," Clara said, with the particular casualness of a child sharing information they know is significant. Sallie looked at Amos Cole, who was demonstrating remarkable interest in his horse's harness buckles. "Mr. Cole should mind his freight and his tongue," she said pleasantly. Amos Cole said something noncommittal and climbed down to help unload. Clara watched the bulls walk into the pasture and immediately turned to her mother with a look that was also her mother's look, that look of quiet calculation. "Is he nice, Mr. Conroy?" "I don't know him well enough to say," Sallie said. "But you're letting him come on Sunday." Sallie looked at her daughter. "How do you know that?" "I heard you telling Mrs. Ogilvy when she came for the egg trade yesterday." "You have very sharp ears." "You have very quiet conversations," Clara countered cheerfully, and went back to watching the bulls. Sallie looked at her daughter's back and felt the particular complicated warmth of a woman who loves her child absolutely and also wishes, occasionally, that the child were slightly less perceptive. She thought about Thomas, which she did every day, usually in the quiet moments, the way grief settles into the ordinary fabric of living after enough time has passed. 14 months. The ache was not gone, would probably never be entirely gone, but it had changed shape, the way things change shape under weather. It was part of her now rather than something that had happened to her, and that was different. She thought about Alfred Conroy standing at the south rail with the purple sky behind him, hat in hand, asking for Sunday with the directness of a man who had decided what he wanted but was asking for it rather than taking it. Thomas had been a good man. Thomas had asked for things too. The memory was tender and she held it for a moment before setting it aside, because there was always something else to do on a working ranch, and standing in the yard doing arithmetic of the heart was not among the tasks on her list. Sunday came in the way that days come on a working ranch, gradually, reluctantly, through all the tasks that precede it. Sallie brushed her good hat on Saturday evening and then told herself she was not doing that for any particular reason, and then told herself she had no obligation to lie to herself in the privacy of her own bedroom, and put the hat on the shelf where it would be ready. Alfred arrived at 9:30 in the morning, riding a solid bay gelding that he kept to an easy trot up the ranch drive, and Sallie was in the yard when he came, because she had been in the yard for unrelated reasons involving the water pump and a piece of leather that needed replacing on the handle, and she had absolutely not been watching the road. He dismounted at the gate and tied his horse with practiced ease, and when he came through, she saw that he had shaved, not that morning necessarily but recently, and his hat was brushed, and he was carrying a small cloth sack that he held out when he was still 5 feet away. "Pecans," he said. "We've got 2 big trees and more than we'll ever use. Clara's age might appreciate them." Clara, who had been inside with strict instructions to stay inside for at least 10 minutes, appeared at the porch steps with absolute immediacy. "I love pecans," she announced. Sallie looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who is choosing her battles. "Clara, this is Alfred Conroy. Alfred, my daughter Clara." Alfred tipped his hat to Clara with complete seriousness, the same formal gesture he would have made to a grown woman. "Miss Clara." Clara looked at him with the thorough, unceremonious evaluation of a child, taking inventory of everything from his boots to the color of his horse. Then she said, "Did you really outbid the unpleasant man for Mama's horse?" "Clara," Sallie said. "I did," Alfred said, without either embarrassment or excessive pride. Clara nodded as if this confirmed something she had already decided. "The horse is in the far paddock. I named him Silver because of his coat. Mama says that's her horse's decision to allow, but I think he likes it." She took the pecans with a polite thank you and went back inside, leaving a small silence behind her that held a particular kind of warmth. Alfred looked at Sallie, and the corners of his eyes were doing something that was almost but not quite a smile. "She's something. She really is," Sallie said. "Come see the bulls." They walked the pasture fence together in the October morning, the air clean and cool, and carrying that particular Panhandle smell of dry grass and distance. The bulls were settling into the pasture with the comfortable authority of large animals who know they are important, and Alfred leaned on the fence post and looked at them with genuine appreciation for the conformation and the condition. He asked practical questions about the herd, about her breeding plan for the spring, and she answered them. And he listened in the way of a man who is actually listening rather than waiting for her to stop talking. At one point he pointed out something about the larger bull's back left leg, a slight stiffness in the way it stood, and he said it the same way he said everything straight and without drama, and asked if she had noticed it or if it was new. She had not noticed it. She looked at it, really looked, and he was right. There was a subtle guardedness in the stance on that side. It might be nothing. It might be worth watching. He said so, and then said nothing else about it, and she appreciated both the information and the restraint. The coffee was on the kitchen table, and Clara was at the other end of it doing her schoolwork with conspicuous diligence when they came in. And Sallie poured 2 cups, and they sat across from each other at the wooden table that had 4 chairs, 2 of which held their morning lives easily and 2 of which were empty in a way that had taken her months not to look at. Alfred wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the window and then at her and said, "How long have you been running the place alone?" 14 months, she said. He nodded. "The mortgage is with the First Territorial Bank in Amarillo." It was not a question. She looked at him. "You know that." I know most of the land records in this county, he said. It's useful to know. I'm not asking about it to pry. He met her eyes. I ask because I know what 14 months of running a place alone with a bank payment looks like, and I want to say that what you did at that auction yesterday was something to see. She was quiet for a moment, holding her coffee cup. Outside, a breeze moved through the yard and the windmill gave its familiar creak. It was arithmetic, she said finally. That's all it was. The arithmetic was steady, he said. Ferris had the money to outlast you and you both knew it and you held your number anyway. I needed that stallion. I know, he said. That's what I mean. Clara looked up from her school book with the air of someone who has been listening to adult conversation with great attention, but is pretending otherwise, and Sallie gave her a look that sent her eyes back to the page without a word being spoken. Alfred stayed until midday. They walked the property and he looked at the cattle with the eye of a man who knew cattle, and he said useful things and mostly let her talk about what she was trying to build, which was the thing she needed most. She realized not someone to build it for her or even someone to help her build it, but someone to talk it out with, someone to think alongside. Thomas had been that. She had not understood until just this moment, sitting on the fence rail watching her new bulls move through the autumn grass, how much she had missed the simple function of thinking out loud with another person who was paying attention. Alfred left after the noon meal, which Clara had produced with great organizational authority, cold biscuits from breakfast, and a jar of preserved peaches, and more of the pecans, which she presented as if she had made them from scratch. He shook Sallie's hand at the gate the way he had shaken it at the stockyard, firm and even, and said he hoped the bull's leg would prove to be nothing, and tipped his hat to both of them and rode easy back down the drive. Clara stood beside her mother and watched him go. "He's coming back," she said with great confidence. "Mind your schoolwork," Sallie said, and went to check the bull's leg, which proved on closer examination to be a minor strain that would resolve in a week. She stood in the pasture with her hand on the bull's flank and felt the strong, indifferent life of the animal under her palm. And then she looked out at the distance where the drive met the road and Alfred Conroy had gone, and she thought, with some surprise, that she hoped Clara was right. He came back the following Saturday, not on Sunday because he had said Sunday last time, and he did not want to seem like a man who operated on a fixed schedule that could be counted on and therefore ignored. He came on Saturday with a practical reason, which was that he had heard through Herschel over in Tascosa that a horse trader named Baines was going to be passing through the county the following week with a string of working horses, and he thought she might want to know because her working string was thin, and Baines had fair prices and honest animals. He told her this at the gate and she listened and thanked him and said that was useful information, and then she said, "You could come in for coffee while you're here." "I was hoping you'd say that," he said, and tied his horse. They sat at the kitchen table again, Clara doing schoolwork again with her suspicious diligence, and this time the conversation was easier, the way conversations get easier when they have been had once before, and the two people in them have had the time to think about what was said and what it meant. Alfred asked about Thomas, not intrusively but openly, the way you ask about someone who mattered to the person sitting across from you, and Sallie answered with the same openness, because talking about Thomas with someone who was not offering condolences but was simply asking to know was a relief she had not expected. She told him that Thomas had been a good man, a hard worker, better with cattle than with money, funny in the dry way of men who have spent long time outdoors. That he had taught her everything practical she knew about running the ranch and had let her learn it rather than doing it for her, which she had sometimes resented in the moment and was grateful for without reservation now. That the fever had been fast, a week from first symptom to the last morning, and that she had been at his side for all of it, and that Clara had been too young to be there but had known anyway, the way children know the things they are not being told. Alfred listened to all of this without filling the quiet places with unnecessary words. When she finished, he said, He sounds like a man who trusted you to know what you were doing." "He did," she said. "Eventually." "It's always eventually," Alfred said. "I think that's the natural order of things between people." Clara looked up. "My father used to say that trust is earned like the land earns rain. It comes when it's ready and not before." She said it with the careful accuracy of a child reciting something important, and then went back to her book. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Sallie looked at Alfred and he looked at her, and something in the room had shifted by Clara's small offering. Some degree of distance had been subtracted. "She remembers well," Alfred said. "She was 8 when he died," Sallie said. "She remembers better than she lets on." He came back the Saturday after that. And then on a Wednesday, because there was a fence question on the east boundary that bordered the Conroy land at one corner, and a practical discussion needed to be had about the condition of the shared fence line, which turned into a morning of walking fence with both of them on horseback, and then turned into a conversation about the fence, and then about the land, and then about everything else, while the horses walked slowly together with their heads low in the November grass. The world around them was beginning to go golden and spare with the coming of real autumn, the cottonwoods along the creek dropping their last leaves, and the grass curring to the color of old wheat, and the sky going the deep particular blue that the Panhandle offers in November as partial compensation for everything else it requires. Alfred rode with his coat open and his hat level, and he watched the land with a quiet attention that she recognized from her own mornings, the way a person who has lived long enough on a piece of ground develops something like a conversation with it. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. It was the kind of question she would not have asked 6 weeks ago. It was the kind of question you only ask someone you have started to trust. He thought about it honestly. Sometimes when it's been a bad year, the winter of '76, the summer of '78 when the grass burned, he paused. "But leaving would mean giving it to someone else, and I find I can't make peace with that. This land has my work in it." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." He looked at her sideways from under his hat brim. "You thought about it after Thomas." "Every morning for about 6 months," she said. "And then one morning I didn't, and then I didn't again, and eventually not thinking about it became the habit." He nodded. The horses moved together at their own pace, the sound of their hooves soft on the dry ground. "I should tell you something," Alfred said. He said it with the deliberateness of someone who has been deciding when to say a thing and has decided now is when. "I'm not a man who does things by halves. I don't come out here twice a week because of fence lines or horse traders or concern about your bull's leg." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I wanted to say it plainly." "You just did." And he said it quietly, without pressure, but she could hear the weight in it, the seriousness of a man who had thought carefully before speaking and now wanted an honest answer. The horses had stopped without being asked, standing still in the November grass with their breath making small white clouds in the cold air. Sallie looked at the horizon for a moment, that long, flat western horizon that went on until the land and sky held their conference at the edge of sight. Then she looked at Alfred. "I have a 10-year-old daughter and a ranch and a bank payment," she said. "I said all that to you on the first day. It's still true." "I know it's still true," he said. "I'm not asking you to set any of it aside." "What are you asking?" He looked at her steadily. "Permission to keep coming," he said, "honestly, not on pretenses." The wind moved through the grass, and somewhere a meadowlark made its last autumn call, improbable and bright in the cold air. Sallie looked at this man on his bay horse in the November light, this man who listened and shaved on Saturdays and brought pecans for her daughter, and had looked at her 3 times in that auction barn, and raised his hat to a woman who was not looking at him. And she felt the careful architecture she had built around herself over 14 months do something it had been resisting for 6 weeks, which was to develop a door. "I'll have coffee ready on Saturday," she said. Alfred looked at her for a moment with those steady brown eyes, and then something happened to his face that she had not seen before, a quiet warmth that moved through it the way warmth moves through a room when a fire catches, and he said, "Saturday then." They moved through the following weeks with the particular delicacy of two adults who have more than themselves to consider, two people who are trying to do a serious thing carefully. Alfred came to the Wallace Ranch on Saturdays and sometimes on Wednesdays, and once on a Thursday, because a problem with the creek water rights needed two opinions, and the visits had a shape now that felt established and right. He brought things pecans when they were fresh, once a good bolt of gingham cloth that Clara had admired through the window of the Millhaven dry goods store when they had all three been in town together for the first time, a small weather vane for the barn roof that he had made himself in his shop on a long evening. Sallie received these things with a practicality that was also a kind of affection, the way she received everything, without excess sentiment, but with a recognition that something was being offered. She made coffee and she fed him at her table, and she argued with him about cattle prices and agreed with him about the creek, and once, on a Saturday when the first winter cold had come down off the staked plains with a serious intent, she sat across from him at the kitchen table after Clara had gone to bed, and they talked for 2 hours with the lamp between them. And at some point the conversation slowed and they were sitting in a comfortable silence that meant something different from any of the silences they had shared before. "It's cold," she said. "You shouldn't ride back tonight." "I'll be fine," he said. "There's a perfectly good room," she said carefully. "That was Thomas's office before. I've been using it for storage, but there's a cot in there and I'll put a blanket on it." He looked at her across the lamp. "Sallie, it's 12 miles and the temperature is dropping and I'm making a practical offer," she said, with the composure of a woman who has made a decision and is presenting it as practical because presenting it as anything else would make it too large to manage tonight. "All right," he said. "Thank you." She set up the cot in the office room and brought 2 heavy blankets and a candle, and said good night without looking at him quite as directly as she usually did. And he said good night, and the door clicked shut, and she went to her own room and lay in the dark listening to the wind move around the house, and thought about the fact that someone was sleeping under her roof for the first time in 14 months. And that it was a particular comfort she had not allowed herself to expect, and had not been prepared for the weight of. In the morning she made a full breakfast, eggs and salt pork, and more of the biscuits and real coffee, and Alfred came out of the office room with his hair slightly unruly from sleep, and took his coffee with both hands and sat at the table while Clara talked at him about the book she was reading, which was a natural history of North American birds, and he listened to everything she said, and asked 2 or 3 questions that were genuine questions. Not the questions adults ask children to be polite, but questions that meant he was actually curious. And Clara glowed with the particular brightness of a child being taken seriously by an adult she has decided to approve of. When he left that morning, after the breakfast dishes were cleared and his horse had been fed and watered in the barn, he stopped at the gate and turned and looked at Sallie, who was standing on the porch, and he held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd like to court you properly. I want to ask that plainly." She stood on the porch in the bright cold morning with her arms folded against the cold and looked at him, this man who was plain and steady and who looked at her 3 times in an auction barn when every other man had looked away. "Properly," she repeated. "Properly," he said. "With respect to you and to Clara, without rushing anything." She was quiet for a moment, and the wind moved and the cattle in the far pasture made their comfortable sounds. "I think," she said slowly, "that what we have been doing for the past 2 months qualifies as that." He considered this. "I suppose it does." "Then continue," she said. He put his hat on and rode down the drive with the winter sun coming over his left shoulder, and she watched him go from the porch until the sound of hooves on the frozen ground faded to nothing. And when Clara appeared at the door behind her with a knowing expression that belonged on someone considerably older than 10, Sallie simply said, "Breakfast dishes," and went inside before her face could say anything she was not ready to say out loud. December came hard to the Panhandle that year, which was not unusual. The wind came down from the north with ice in its teeth, and the cattle drifted south against every fence, and the water troughs froze every night and had to be broken open every morning. Sallie did this work, as she did all the work, steadily and without complaint, but the cold pressed harder on a single pair of hands than it did on two, and there were mornings when the weight of it sat on her chest like the frost sat on the fence posts, hard and white and slow to lift. Alfred came through a hard, early December storm to check on the stock and to make sure her wood supply was adequate, and when he arrived, she was in the process of hauling wood from the stack behind the barn, and he took the load from her without a word and brought it to the porch, and then went back for more, and she let him because it was cold and there was too much to do, and letting help was its own kind of strength. She had learned. Clara was inside with a cold that had settled in her chest, nothing serious but enough to keep her at the table with her blanket around her, and Sallie moved between the child and the outside work with the divided attention of a mother who is also a rancher, and Alfred understood without being told what was needed and did the outside things, the water troughs and the wood and the check on the cattle, and came inside to warm his hands and reported on the condition of the herd in the straightforward way she needed the information. 2 heifers are close to the northwest fence, he said, not in distress but bunched tight, worth an eye tonight. I'll check at dark, she said. I can stay, he said. He said it without weight, without making it mean more than it meant, which was that he was offering his presence and his labor, and that was all he was offering in a house where a sick child slept and a woman's reputation mattered to her livelihood. I know, she said, but I'll manage. He looked at Clara, who was watching this exchange over her blanket with her mother's eyes. How's your chest? He asked her. Better than this morning, Clara said. Mama put a mustard plaster on it. It smells terrible, but it helps. It always does, he agreed, with the personal confidence of someone who had also worn mustard plasters in cold winters. He left at dusk, as the temperature was dropping again toward what would be a bitter night, and before he went he stood at the gate and said quietly to Sallie, "Send word if you need anything, I mean that." "I know you do," she said. "I mean it about the heifers specifically," he said. "I know," she said again, and there was something in her voice that was softer than usual, worn down to something true by the cold and the day and his simple, consistent presence. He heard it, she could tell from the way he paused, but he did not push at it. He just tipped his hat and went, and she stood in the cold until the sound of his horse was gone, and then went in to sit beside Clara and feel the particular gratitude of a woman who has someone thinking about her, even from 12 miles away. Christmas that year was a quiet thing. Sallie made a turkey from a bird she had fattened through the fall, and Clara made a dried apple cake that was ambitious in execution and better than expected in result. And they sat together at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the wind outside, and talked about Thomas in the way that has become their Christmas tradition, sharing the memories they liked best, the funny ones and the warm ones, because grief deserved its rituals and Christmas was one of them. Alfred had sent a gift by way of a neighbor who was passing the Wallace Road on the 24th, a small wooden box with a latch, made with the careful joinery of a man who worked wood with the same patience he brought to everything else, and inside the box was a handwritten note that said, "For keeping good things in. Merry Christmas to both of you." A.C. Clara declared it the best gift she had received besides her bird-watching book, and installed it immediately on the shelf beside her bed to keep her collection of interesting stones and feathers. Sallie read the note 3 times and then folded it and kept it in her own pocket, which was not a thing she made a decision to do. It was simply where her hand put it. She sent back, by the same neighbor on Christmas morning, a pair of gloves she had been making over the previous 3 weeks in the evenings, after Clara was asleep, cut from good leather with neat, even stitching. She had put no note with them because the gloves said what needed saying, which was that she had spent considerable time making something specifically for his hands, and if that was not a statement of some kind, then nothing was. He wore them the next Saturday when he rode out, and when she noticed them on his hands as he tied his horse at the gate, something in her chest did the thing it had been doing more and more often. The thing that was warm and uncomfortable at once, that was frightening in the way that good things are frightening when you have had them taken away before and know what it costs. January was hard and February was harder. The way Panhandle winters arranged themselves in those years, and the work of keeping the ranch alive through the cold consumed most of every day and left the evenings short and the sleep deep. Alfred came when he could, which was most Saturdays and some Wednesdays, and they had developed by now the easy practical rhythm of two people who have decided on each other, even if they have not yet said so in the particular words that make it official. He helped her with a difficult calving in February, one of her best heifers presenting badly in a way that required two sets of hands, and they worked together in the lamplight of the barn for 2 cold hard hours until the calf came out alive, and the heifer stood up and turned to look at her calf with the tired, stunned satisfaction of every mother who has done something enormous in lives. And Alfred sat back against the barn wall and looked at the calf, and then at Sallie. Both of them dirty and cold and out of breath, and he said, "That was good work," and she said, "That was both of us," and they looked at each other in the way that people look at each other after doing something together. That mattered, the look that is its own kind of intimacy. She almost said it then. She was close enough to say it. The feelings had been building in her for months with the steady accumulation of small moments, each one a small stone laid on a structure, and the structure was very solid now, and she knew what it was, and she thought she knew what it was for him too. But she was also very dirty from 2 hours of calving assistance, and the lamp was low and the heifer was tired, and so instead she said, "There's stew on the stove from this morning. It'll still be warm." "Good," he said, and stood up, and they went to the house. March came in slowly, and then all at once, the way spring comes to the Panhandle. One morning the sky just different, the quality of the light changed, the grass showing its first green along the creek bank. It was the kind of change that lifted something in a person whether or not they had been waiting for it, a physical loosening. It was a Saturday in mid-March, the first truly warm day of the year, and they were sitting on the porch after the noon meal, which had become a natural thing. The sitting on the porch after the meal, both of them in the wooden chairs that Sallie had brought outside when the weather first permitted it. And Clara was down at the creek doing something with a stick and a collection of interesting mud that she had been organizing for unclear purposes since the previous afternoon. The land was wide open and green beginning around them, and the cattle moved slowly in the pasture with the ease of animals that have survived the winter and know the warmth, and the windmill was turning in a light southwest breeze that smelled like the spring from a long way off. Alfred was quiet for a long time, and she was comfortable with his quiet in a way she was comfortable with very little else, and then he said without looking at her, "I want to say something." "All right," she said. He looked at the land in front of them, the Wallace land, the land she had held through the cold and the grief and the arithmetic. "I love you," he said. "I've known it since about October, and I've been trying to find the right time to say it, and I've decided there isn't a right time. There's just time, and this is it." The porch was very quiet except for the windmill. Sallie set her coffee cup down on the arm of her chair with complete care. She had known it was coming, had felt it approaching the way you feel a change in weather, and she had spent considerable time thinking about what she would say when it arrived. And now that it was here, she found that all the careful thinking had produced exactly one thing, which was the truth. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while." He turned and looked at her then, and his face in the spring light was open in a way she had only seen it approach before, never arrive, and the warmth in it was enormous and steady and real. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "I'm asking, not telling. I understand that Clara has a say in it as much as you do, and I understand that your name means something to you, and I'm not asking you to lose it." Sallie looked at him for a long time. She thought about Thomas, a brief and tender thought, the kind that was a goodbye rather than a reason to stay. She thought about the auction barn and the way he had looked at her and lifted his hat to a woman who was not even looking at him, just because it was the right thing to do, because something in him recognized something in her before they had even spoken. She thought about 14 months of being alone on this land and 6 months of not being quite alone anymore, of what it felt like to have someone think about her from 12 miles away. "I need to ask Clara first," she said. "I know," he said. "I'd expect nothing less," she called down toward the creek. "Clara, come up here, please." There was a splash and some rustling, and Clara appeared from the creek bank with muddy boots, and that bright particular attention that meant she had heard enough to know what was being called for. She came up the bank and stood at the edge of the porch and looked from her mother to Alfred with the expression of a judge who is about to deliver a verdict she has been composing for months. "Mr. Conroy has something to ask you," Sallie said. Alfred looked at Clara with the full seriousness of his attention and said, "I'd like to ask your mother to marry me, but this is your home and your family, and I want to know what you think about it." Clara looked at him for a long time. She looked at her boots, which were comprehensively muddy. She looked at her mother. She looked back at Alfred. "Would we move to your ranch?" "I've been thinking about that," Alfred said. "I thought perhaps we'd discuss it together, all three of us. There are good arguments for either place. Your mother's land matters to her, and I respect that." "Would you still come for Saturday coffee?" Clara asked. "Every Saturday," he said, "whether we're here or there." Clara thought about this for another moment with great seriousness. Then she said, "My father would have liked you. He liked people who were straight about things." She said it carefully, the way she had said the quote about trust and rain, as if it were something she had been holding for the right occasion. "I think it's a good idea," she added, and then went back to the creek bank with her muddy boots, as if she had not just settled the largest question of the last year. Sallie looked at Alfred. Alfred looked at Sallie. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. And then the smile came, the one that escaped before she gave it permission, the one that made her look younger and less guarded and wholly herself, and this time it stayed. He reached across the space between the two porch chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the March afternoon with the windmill turning, and the cattle moving in the green beginning pasture, and her daughter at the creek, doing whatever important thing she was doing with her stick and her mud. They married in June of 1880 in the small white Methodist church in Millhaven, on a morning that was warm but not yet the brutal heat of full summer, with a sky so blue and clear it looked like something had been recently washed. Reverend Totham performed the ceremony with the efficient warmth of a man who had done many marriages and still believed in the institution. About 40 people attended, which was a sizable gathering for Millhaven, and included most of the county's ranching families and several of the townspeople and Amos Cole the freighter, who sat in the back row with his hat on his knee, and the expression of a man who feels responsible for things he was not responsible for. Clara was the sole attendant, wearing the blue gingham that had been cut from the bolt Alfred brought the previous fall, which Sallie and a neighbor woman named Mrs. Pierce had sewn into a dress over the winter. Clara wore it with the dignity of someone who understands the significance of what they are wearing, and stood beside her mother at the altar with her hands clasped and her back straight. Alfred stood at the front of the church and watched Sallie come down the narrow aisle on no one's arm, which was her decision and the right one, and he thought she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen, not because of the cream-colored wedding dress or the flowers in her pinned auburn hair, but because of the way she walked, the same way she had walked into that auction barn 9 months ago, straight and deliberate and unhurried, as if she had thought carefully about every step and found it worth taking. He had worn his good hat, the charcoal gray one, freshly brushed. He took it off when she reached him, and she smiled at him, and Reverend Totham began. The question of whose ranch had been resolved over the winter, through the honest discussion Alfred had promised, with all three of them at the kitchen table. They would make their home on the Wallace Ranch, because the land was Sallie's by more than legal right, by the work of her hands and her husband's grave in the southeast corner under the 2 cottonwood trees, and because Alfred's spread was adjacent and the boundary fence could come down, and the land run together as one operation, which was a practical arrangement that also happened to reflect what they were doing with everything else in their lives. Alfred's foreman, a solid man named Dale Ricks who had been with the Conroy spread for 4 years, would manage the northeast section while Alfred based himself at the Wallace place. The combined operation, which they called the Wallace-Conroy Ranch on the formal papers, but which everyone in the county simply called the Big Spread on the North Fork, would run close to 700 acres and a herd that numbered 200 and growing, including the issue of the 2 Hereford bulls that Sallie had purchased at the Millhaven autumn auction 9 months before, who had done their work through the winter with professional commitment, and whose calves were among the finest in the county that spring. The wedding supper was held in the Millhaven Community Hall, tables set end to end and covered with the combined effort of most of the women in the county, and there was a fiddle player and a guitarist, and a dancing area cleared at one end of the hall. Alfred danced with Sallie first, which he did with the deliberate, careful competence of a man who had practiced, and she knew he had practiced because she had seen him watching the fiddle player at a community gathering in April with an expression of strategic assessment, and she was moved by it, the small private preparation he had made for this moment. Clara danced with Burl Oakes, who treated her with complete ceremony, and then with Alfred, who spun her around with enough abandon that she laughed the way children laugh when they are fully happy, from the stomach, without qualification. Clement Ferris did not attend, which was noted by no one with regret. He had, over the fall and winter, made 2 or 3 further attempts to acquire property adjacent to the Wallace Ranch through the particular methods of a man who mistakes money for entitlement, and each time the offer had been declined, and the matter had been settled quietly and firmly, with the kind of county-wide social calculation that tends to go against a man who is seen to crowd widows and newcomers at auction. He was not a wicked man in any dramatic sense, just a man who had been allowed too much for too long, and the county had begun to recalibrate on that particular point in the slow, collective way that communities sometimes do. After the supper, after the dancing, after the last guests had gone to their wagons, and the lanterns in the hall had been turned down one by one, Alfred and Sallie rode home to the Wallace Ranch in the warm June night under a sky full of stars that were excessive in their brightness, the way Panhandle stars are in June, and Clara rode between them on her little gray pony, half asleep but unwilling to admit it, until Alfred lifted her down at the barn without waking her entirely and carried her into the house and put her in her bed with her boots off, and Sallie stood at the bedroom door watching him do this, with an expression she could not have described exactly but felt as something full and real and entirely her own. He turned from the bed and found her watching, and they stood in the quiet of the hallway for a moment. "Hello, husband," she said. The warmth in his face was that same enormous steady thing. "Hello, wife," he said. Summer moved through the land with its characteristic authority, pressing heat into every corner of every day, and the ranch moved through summer with them, the work and the life of it running in and around each other the way water runs in and around stones, always moving, always finding a path. Alfred was a good rancher and a good partner, the kind who did his work without requiring credit for it, and noticed what needed noticing, and said what needed saying in the plain, straight way she had come to value like water. They argued occasionally about cattle prices or fence decisions or the right approach to a difficult neighbor on the south boundary, and they argued well, which is to say with the honesty of 2 people who trust each other enough to disagree, and with the courtesy of 2 people who respect each other enough to listen. They almost always found a way through, and the few times they did not, they let time do the work and came back to it. Clara grew 3 inches that summer and developed an absolute authority about the natural history of the local bird population that Alfred supported with a pair of good field glasses he had mail-ordered from a catalog, and presented to her on her 11th birthday with a seriousness that she received with equal seriousness. because Alfred and Clara had developed their own particular understanding, the kind that grows between a child and an adult who treat each other as people rather than roles. There was a man from the Panhandle Land Office who came through in August with forms regarding the consolidation of the two ranch parcels, and he spent 20 minutes trying to explain the process to Sallie before realizing she had read and understood the relevant provisions before he arrived and had prepared the necessary signatures, and he went away with the slightly dazed air of a man who has made assumptions that the world has declined to honor. Alfred, who had been in the barn during this exchange and came in afterward, listened to Sallie's account of it over the noon meal with the expression he had when he was trying not to smile and not quite succeeding. "You let him finish his explanation," Alfred said. "It seemed kind," she said. "You are a good deal more patient than I would have been." "I have practice," she said. "Also, I needed his signature." He looked at her across the table with that quiet warmth and said, "I married an extremely formidable woman." "You did," she agreed. In October, 14 months after the auction that had started all of this, Sallie looked at her calendar and then at Alfred across the breakfast table and said, with the composure of a woman making a practical announcement, "I believe we're expecting a child." The stillness that settled over Alfred Conroy in that moment was not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a man receiving something enormous with both hands, with his whole careful attention. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time with his full face open in that way that she had first seen on the porch in March when she said she loved him, that enormous steady warmth, and then he said, "When?" "April, I think," she said. "Maybe early May." He came around the table without hurry and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands in his and looked up at her. And she looked down at him. And neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying. The fact of it said everything. Clara, who came in from outside 5 minutes later with her field glasses around her neck and a dead certain look in her eyes, said, "There's a red-tailed hawk nesting in the old cottonwood by the east fence," and stopped when she looked at their faces. "What happened?" "Nothing is wrong," Sallie said. "Something good has happened." Clara looked at her mother and then at Alfred and then at her mother again, doing the arithmetic the way her mother had taught her. "Oh," she said. Then, after a moment, with a slowness that meant she was thinking it through and finding it satisfactory, "Oh, that's good." "It is good," Alfred said from his crouched position beside Sallie's chair, and Clara looked at him down there and made the face she made when adults were being sentimental in ways she was not ready to fully participate in and said, "I'm going to look at the hawk," and went back outside. The autumn was full and golden, and the calf crop from the new bulls was excellent beyond what Sallie had hoped for. Well-built calves with the Hereford substance, and the mixed-breed hardiness she had been aiming for when she stood at the Millhaven auction 14 months ago with her ledger and her arithmetic. The sale of the calves in November brought enough to make the December mortgage payment, and the one after that. And the banker in Amarillo received the payment without comment, which was all Sallie needed from him. Alfred rode with her to Amarillo to make the December payment, 2 days on the road and an overnight in town, which was the first time they had been away from the ranch together without Clara, who stayed with Mrs. Pierce and reported on the experience afterward as acceptable, but Mrs. Pierce's idea of supper is extremely conservative. In Amarillo, they stayed at a respectable hotel and ate supper at a restaurant with tablecloths, and had a full evening to themselves in a town where nobody required anything of them, which felt extravagant in the way that ordinary things become extravagant when you have not had them in a very long time. They walked the Amarillo Main Street after supper in the cold, clear November evening, Alfred's arm through hers, not because either of them needed the support, but because it felt like the right use of an arm. Sallie looked at the lighted windows of the shops and thought about the fact that she had been here a year ago, nearly to the week, making the same November mortgage payment with the compressed efficiency of a woman who could not afford to spend more time or money in town than strictly necessary. The difference between that woman and this one was not dramatic or easily described. She was the same person, the same arithmetic, the same 400 acres and 10-year-old daughter and auburn hair and calculating brown eyes. She had just in the year between acquired a partner in the full sense of the word, someone to do the arithmetic alongside. "What are you thinking about?" Alfred said. They were standing outside the window of a hardware store looking at a display of tools. "The price of flat iron," she said, which was partly true. He looked at her sideways. "What else?" "This time last year," she said, "how different it felt." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the hardware window. "Better or worse?" "Better," she said. "Different in all the ways that are better." She looked at him. "That's not easy to say, exactly. Because the things that were there before were also real and worth having. But what we have now is also real, and I am grateful for it. And I wanted to say that plainly because you say things plainly, and I've learned that from you." He looked at her for a moment, there in the November street of Amarillo with the lamplight on both of them. And then he put his free hand over hers where it rested in the crook of his arm, and she felt the warmth of those hands, the gloved hands she had made him last Christmas. And she pressed her own hand against his, and they stood for a moment just like that, in the street, not moving, saying nothing, which was its own kind of everything. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was milder than the previous one, a grace note from the weather gods who apparently had their own sense of timing, and the work of keeping the ranch through the cold was hard but not brutal, the water troughs manageable, and the cattle holding their condition, and the wood supply adequate. Sallie moved through the winter with the practical adjustments of a woman in the later months of a pregnancy on a working ranch, which meant she adapted her work rather than stopping it, reassigning the heavier tasks with the same clear-eyed efficiency she brought to everything. And Alfred worked alongside her with the careful, non-fussing attentiveness of a man who understood the difference between help and oversight. The only difficulty was a week in February when she had a bad spell of exhaustion that kept her at the table and the bed more than the pasture. And Alfred ran the outside work with Dale Ricks and came in at midday to eat with her, and in the evenings to sit with her by the fire. And Clara administered to her mother with the authority of a natural nurse and the bedside manner of someone who had decided that the patient's job was to rest, and the caretaker's job was to enforce this. "You are both overwhelming me," Sallie said on the third day of this. "Good," said Clara. "You've been overwhelming this ranch for years," Alfred said. "It's our turn." She looked at him with the look that meant she was pretending to find something annoying when she did not, and he looked back at her with the look that meant he knew the difference. And Clara watched this exchange with 11-year-old comprehension and went back to her book. The baby came on the 1st of May, 1881. In the bedroom of the Wallace Conroy Ranch, with a midwife named Mrs. Holt who had attended half the births in the county and had an unshakable calm that radiated through difficult rooms. The birth was long, and the morning was very far along before it was finished, and when it was finished and Mrs. Holt put the wrapped bundle in Sallie's arms, Sallie looked at the small red face of her son with the same expression she had worn at the auction barn and in the porch chairs, and at the hotel window, that particular clear-eyed fullness, that look of someone who has done their arithmetic and found the sum exceeds the calculation. It was a boy. Alfred Conroy the younger, though they would call him Henry, which had been Alfred's father's name, and the name had a solid, steady weight to it that suited the child, who was, from the first hour, a solid, steady presence with his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and an opinion about everything that suggested he would be running things at the earliest opportunity. Alfred came into the room when Mrs. Holt came to get him, and he stood at the bedside and looked at his son in Sallie's arms with that stillness that was not shock but reception. And Sallie looked up at him and said, "Henry," and he said, "Henry," and reached out one careful hand and touched the baby's dark hair with a gentleness that belonged to the same man who had shaken her hand at the auction and fixed the fence line and hauled the winter wood and carried Clara to bed in her wedding night boots. Clara came in after with the field glasses still around her neck because she had been watching birds in the east pasture when the midwife came to fetch her, and she stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her brother with the thorough assessment she brought to important things. "He's very small," she said. "He won't always be," Alfred said. "Will he be annoying?" she asked. "Probably sometimes," Sallie said. "You can help with that." Clara considered this. "All right," she said, and leaned over and looked at Henry more closely. And Henry, who was not entirely asleep, opened his eyes the narrow crack of a newborn's first look at the world. And Clara made a sound that was not quite a word but was entirely unmistakable in its meaning, the sound of someone meeting something that has already changed them. Summer came to the Panhandle, and the ranch ran with the full, deep life of a working place in a good season, cattle healthy and grass strong and the creek running clear. And the family that moved through it found its rhythms the way all families find their rhythms, through repetition and adjustment and the steady accumulation of days that become years. Henry grew in the particular rapid way of ranch babies, fed by good air and outdoor light and the attentive management of his sister, who had appointed herself his primary educator from the moment he could sit up, and showed remarkable patience with his rate of absorption. Sallie rode her gray roan stallion out to check the cattle on June mornings, sometimes alone with Henry in a carrier her neighbor Mrs. Pierce had helped her construct from canvas and leather, and sometimes with Alfred beside her on his bay, and the land spread around them with its huge, indifferent beauty, the grass running in the wind, and the sky going its impossible blue above the flat rim of the world. On a morning in late June, they rode the fence of the east boundary together while Henry slept in his carrier against his mother's chest, and the early light was low and golden, and the shadows of the fence posts ran long across the grass. Alfred was quiet beside her, which he often was in the mornings, letting the day find its own pace, and she rode beside him with the ease of a woman completely at home in the place she is. She thought about the autumn auction. She thought about the way she had walked into that barn in October of 1879 with her ledger and her arithmetic and her determination, and the way the whole room had looked at her with that particular quality of surprised attention, and the way she had not looked back at any of them because she had too much to do to be distracted by their surprise. And she thought about a man in a charcoal hat on the far left bleacher who had looked at her once, and then a second time, and then a third time, and raised his hat to a woman who was not even looking at him, just because it was the right gesture, just because something in him had known something before his mind caught up with it. "What are you thinking about?" Alfred said beside her. "The auction," she said. He looked at her with a half-smile because he knew which auction she meant. "The bulls were good investments," he said. "They were," she agreed, "among other things." He reached over from his horse and took her hand for a moment, the way he had taken it in the Amarillo Street, and Henry slept between them in his canvas carrier, and the morning light laid itself across the grass, and the wide land ran to all the horizons with nothing between them and the sky. And Sallie Wallace, who was Sallie Conroy now though the Wallace was still on the deed and always would be, held her husband's hand and her sleeping son against her chest, and rode into the morning with the full certain weight of a life that was entirely, irreducibly, her own. The mortgage with the First Territorial Bank in Amarillo was paid in full by the spring of 1883, 2 years and some months after the wedding, the result of 3 good calf crops and 1 extraordinary sale of breeding stock in which the Wallace-Conroy Hereford line had turned out to be exactly as good as Sallie had calculated that October morning in the auction barn, when she had done her arithmetic 3 times, and decided the bulls were worth the price. Alfred made the final payment himself, riding to Amarillo in March with the sum in a bank draft, and came back with the receipt and the cleared title, and laid it on the kitchen table in front of Sallie with the expression of a man delivering excellent news. She looked at it for a long time. Henry, who was nearly 2 and had strong opinions about everything on the table, tried to take the paper, and Alfred moved it out of reach. Sallie picked it up and held it and felt the particular weight of a thing that had been pressing for a very long time when it is set down at last. "Thank you," she said. She looked at Alfred. "Not for paying it, for being here while we did." He sat down across from her at the table that had always had 4 chairs, 2 of which had been empty in different ways at different times, and were now occupied in the way she had once stopped allowing herself to hope for. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You bought those bulls. We brought the calves to market. Together," he agreed. Henry, having been denied the interesting paper, had moved on to investigating the contents of the bread basket, which he was doing with great energy. Clara, who was 13 now and had 4 inches on her mother and an opinion about the bread basket too, appeared from the back room and removed it from her brother's orbit without breaking conversational stride with the historical fact she was in the middle of explaining, which concerned the migratory patterns of the whooping crane. "There are fewer than before," she said, putting the bread out of reach. "The hunting has been very bad for them. I think somebody ought to do something about that." "You could write a letter," Alfred said seriously. Clara considered this. "To whom?" "The Smithsonian Institution has an ornithology department," Alfred said. "I read something about it in the Amarillo paper." Clara looked at him with the expression she had when someone had surprised her with useful information. "All right," she said. "I'll write a letter." Sallie looked at her husband over the cleared title deed and Henry's disappearing into the corner with a biscuit, and Clara already moving to the writing desk with the efficient purpose of someone who has found their direction. And the kitchen was warm and full and noisy, in all the ways a kitchen should be noisy. And outside the window the March sun was cutting through the last of the winter clouds and turning the grass of the Wallace Conroy ranch to gold. She folded the deed and put it in the wooden box on the shelf, the box Alfred had sent at Christmas in 1879, the one with the careful joinery and the note about keeping good things in. It had held many things over the years, the Christmas note, the folded records of the ranch's best seasons, the letter from Clara's teacher about her exceptional work, the small pressed flower that Henry had brought her from the creek bank last summer with the gravity of a child offering a treasure. The deed fit perfectly. Alfred watched her close the box, and she turned and found him watching, and they looked at each other across the kitchen that held everything they had made together. The 3 years and the 2 children, and the 700 acres, and the bred-up cattle, and the settled mortgage, and the Saturday coffees, and the winter nights and the spring mornings. All of it gathered in the simple fact of 2 people who had found each other in an auction barn on an October afternoon and had, with patience and straight talking and the daily willingness to choose each other over and over, built something worth having. "Coffee," she said. "Always," he said. She put the pot on the stove, and the sun came through the window, and Henry finished his biscuit and came back to hold his arms up to his father, who lifted him with the ease of practice. And Clara was at the writing desk composing her letter to the Smithsonian with the authority of someone who has already decided she will be heard. And outside, the windmill turned in the March wind, and the cattle moved in the spring grass of the valley that the Wallaces had held and the Conroys had joined, and the 2 together had made into a life. The coffee came to a boil, and the kitchen filled with the smell of it, the good ordinary smell of a morning that is itself and nothing less. And Sallie Wallace poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down across from her husband and her son and her daughter, and the land through the window that ran to every horizon under the Panhandle sky. And she thought, as she sometimes did, of the woman who had walked into that auction barn alone with her arithmetic and her ledger. And she thought of her with great tenderness, that woman who was her and also someone she had moved through and passed on the way to here. And she thought, I hope you could have seen this. And she picked up her coffee cup and looked at Alfred, and he looked at her, and she thought, I think she would have been glad.